I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling something hard pressing beneath my pillow. When I pulled it out, it was a small pink stone, tied with a white ribbon, and a slip of paper with a hastily written note. For Fertility. The room was absolutely silent. Evan slept peacefully beside me, his breathing slow and steady. I sat up, staring at the stone in my hand, the coldness of it slowly spreading up my neck. His mother once told me, "A good wife is a patient wife." Perhaps this was her way of teaching me patience. The next morning, I placed the stone on the dining table, right next to his coffee cup. Evan barely glanced at it, saying nothing. "Do you know about this?" I asked. He just shrugged. "My mother is just worried about you, that's all." "Aren't you going to talk to her?" I pressed. Evan folded his newspaper, his voice completely level. "Talk about what?" "Last night, I found this stone under my pillow." He looked at me, his eyes showing no surprise. "You're overthinking it again. You'd be okay with someone sneaking something like that into your bed? It's just a blessing, Claire." The kitchen was softly lit. The slight sound of the spoon hitting the mug felt colder than any words. I looked at the coffee steam rising between us, thin, fragile, like the last breath of something that was once warm. Evan smiled faintly, his tone softening slightly. "Mom just wants to help. Don't make such a big deal out of everything." I remained silent. In that moment I understood. Some cracks don't begin with a fight, but with a silence that lasts too long. He stood up, gave me a light kiss on the forehead, and walked toward the door. I sat there, listening to the sound of the door closing behind him, and all that was left was the clock, stressing every tired second. If you ever see something small that starts to change your life, something you thought was harmless but is quietly destroying what you believe to be true, then you'll understand why I couldn't just sit still after that morning. Make sure to subscribe, because the next part will show you, sometimes, the most frightening thing is not the lie, but the silence of the one you love. Mornings in Oregon are dim and cold, like a held breath. The light filtered through the curtains, sweeping a thin line across the wooden countertop. I stood by the sink, listening to the clock's steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the distant salt air of the coast, creating an atmosphere that was both awake and deeply melancholic. The house was silent, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind scraping against the window panes. Evan walked in, his dress shirt still showing faint crease marks. He poured his coffee without looking at me. "Any news yet?" His voice was flat, as if the question didn't actually require an answer. I managed a small smile, trying to keep my tone light. "No, I guess it takes time." My own voice sounded monotonous and dull in the kitchen, like the wind whistling through a crack in the door. The coffee cup steamed, a fleeting breath of anticipation, then cooled so quickly I didn't even take another sip. Inside, the delay felt like a sentence, yet I sat still, like someone resigned to awaiting a verdict. He opened his work journal and scribbled a few lines. The light reflected off the black cover like an invisible gun. I watched his hand move, slowly, meticulously, as if he were writing a chemical formula instead of the script of two people's lives. "Did you sleep okay last night?" he asked, still not looking up. "Yes," I answered, adding silently in my head, "Not really." He nodded, a gesture so slight it was almost non-existent. Between us, the smallest sounds were amplified. The pen scratching, the wind, the second-hand ticking. There was no sound of people truly living here. "My mother is stopping by this afternoon," he said. "She said she has something for you." "Another gift?" "Nothing big. She cares." I let out a short, hollow laugh. In this house, the word care always came with conditions. I stood up to clear the extra mug, the gentle clink of porcelain on porcelain. echoing the memory of mornings past, warm but never truly comfortable. He closed his journal with a dry clack. "We'll be fine. We just need to keep trying." I nodded. I always nodded, because nodding was simpler than asking a follow-up question. As he walked past, his hand brushed lightly against my shoulder, an old habit, now devoid of meaning. "Call me if Keller emails," he said. "Sure." The door opened, letting in a rush of wind that pulled at the curtains. When it closed, the house returned to silence. I sat down in the chair he'd just vacated, my fingers accidentally touching a cold, damp spot on the table. Outside, waves crashed against the rocky shore, a dull, distant sound, repeating like the heartbeat of the ocean itself. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed a pale blue. No email. I scrolled down, finding only automated advertisements for fertility treatments and a few generic updates. I deleted them all without hesitation. Not out of shame, but because I hated how hope had turned a person into mere statistical data. I closed the lid. The morning light slanted onto the wall, shining through a glass vase holding dried chrysanthemums. The petals were dark and curled like slender fingers slowly closing. I couldn't remember the last time I'd changed the water, perhaps since everything started to go quiet. My phone vibrated. "Mom, are you up?" I typed back, "Always." My mother was on the other side of the country, where the morning arrived 2 hours earlier. I didn't tell her about mornings like this. Americans are used to saying, "It's fine," when something is quietly breaking. I was no different. I washed the cup, warm water running over my fingers, turning my skin pink. The heat reminded me that I could still feel. Sometimes that alone was enough to keep going. I wiped the table dry, folding the cloth. The house was so tidy it felt empty. The clock still stressed every tired second. I turned, letting my gaze fall on an empty picture frame on the wall. It was meant to hold our future family photo. Now it only reflected the gray sky creeping through the curtains. I didn't know when that emptiness had become so truthful. I closed the back door, my hand resting on the latch for a moment longer than usual. Outside, the wind shifted. The house exhaled, softly and long. I stood still, listening to my own heart blend with the sound of the waves. And in that minute, I realized the question was still there, but this morning I didn't have to answer it anymore. The morning arrived late. The light was weak, painting a dim silver expanse on the wall. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty space in front of me. Now, it felt like a mirror reflecting my own vacant gaze. It wasn't truly a mirror, just a flat, light-reflecting surface. Yet it was enough to see my face blend into the wall color, pale, cold, and as unpredictable as the weather on this coast. I didn't look for long. When you look too closely, all you see is your own weariness. I held the mug in my hand. The bottom was dry, only a faint trace of the cool, long-gone liquid remaining. I whispered to myself, every morning, I wake up to his question and lose myself. My voice was small, falling like a piece of dust. Then I went silent. A knock came at the door. 3 even, gentle taps, soft but impossible to ignore. I knew who it was. Only Margaret knocked like that, polite, unhurried, yet demanding immediate attention. When I opened the door, she stood there with a fruit basket. For fertility. Red apples, yellow oranges, a few sprigs of mint and lavender tucked between them. Arranged like a bouquet meant more for symbolism than beauty. Her hands smelled faintly of lavender, her voice smooth as honey. "I'm just stopping by briefly," she said, a slow smile spreading across her carefully made-up face. "It's good for your health. You should eat some every day." I invited her in. In the kitchen, the scent from the basket clung to the air, so sweet it felt almost artificial. She placed the basket on the counter, adjusted the bow, and then let her eyes sweep around the room. "This house is always so clean. You remind me of myself when I was younger." I replied with a thin smile. Thank you, Margaret. Margaret sat on a chair, her hands clasped, her eyes gentle yet fixed on me. What did Dr. Keller say? Nothing new yet. She nodded. Perhaps it just needs a little more time. I brought a new tea from Italy. They say it's wonderful for preparation. I nodded, asking no further questions. Every word of hers was coated in sugar, sweet, easy to swallow, and difficult to argue against. A moment later, she stood up and moved closer. Her breath carried a faint scent of mint. She gently touched my abdomen. You will understand one day. Her smile was kind, her eyes soft. But the gesture left me feeling invaded. I instinctively took a small step back, but she didn't notice. It's all for you, dear, she said, her voice softening like she was soothing a child. You'll see. Motherhood is the most natural thing in the world. I pressed my lips together and simply nodded. Every time she used the word natural, I felt something inside me contract. Margaret glanced at her watch. I must go. The tea is in the car. Evan will bring it in later. Okay. She stepped out the door, turning back one last time. Keep your spirits up, Claire. All good things require faith. I saw her out. When the door closed, the room returned to quiet. But the scent of lavender lingered heavily in the air, persistent, sweet, and stifling. I opened the window to let the wind rush in, but only for a moment before the scent crept back. I cleared the counter, putting the empty basket aside. An apple rolled out, bouncing once on the floor, stopping near the base of the table. I bent down to pick it up. The smooth, cold skin felt real in my palm. I placed it in the sink and turned on the water. The warm stream washed over it, rinsing away the waxy sheen, leaving a duller but truer surface. I looked down at my hands, then around the kitchen. Everything was exactly as before. Quiet, tidy, clean. But inside me something had just shifted. Very slightly, like a breath finally escaping after being held too long. Outside, the waves still hit the rocky shore, steady and weary. I closed the window, leaving the wind outside. As I turned away, the light from the door cast a long, slanting shadow on the wall, fading with the hour. It reflected nothing now, just a silent white expanse. I sat down, took a deep breath, and whispered, Maybe understanding isn't necessary anymore. The first parcel arrived on Monday morning, wrapped in beige paper with a pale gold ribbon, the handwriting soft and consistent. For your new journey, my dear. No signature was needed. I knew instantly. On Tuesday, another small box. Then came Wednesday. The gifts arrived in quick succession. Uterine teas, crystal bracelets, handwritten letters from a convent. Each box released a distinct scent, but, when mixed together, the room became overwhelmingly, suffocatingly sweet. I laid them out on the counter, neatly aligned as if preparing an exhibit. In that cloying atmosphere, the clearest sound was my own heartbeat, slow, reluctant, as if unused to such dense attention. Evan came home late. He looked at the pile of boxes and smiled. My mother is just worried about you. His voice was light, as if commenting on the weather. I looked at him, realizing that smile had been used too many times, like a permanent free pass. Do you think this is a bit much? I asked. She just wants to help. Help by sending hundreds of grams of metaphysical stones and 10 different kinds of tea? He shrugged. You're too sensitive, Claire. My mother does this because she cares. I didn't press the issue. Some dialogues were too familiar to find new ground. I gathered the boxes, stacking them in the corner of the room. As I leaned down, I heard the subtle rustle of the paper. The sound felt like someone breathing down my neck. That night I opened one tea packet. The label read, Rebirth Blend, Women's Harmony. I brewed a cup. Steam rose, releasing an aroma of herbs mixed with dried flowers and earth. I waited for it to cool, then took a sip. A heavy, indefinable bitterness spread across my throat. I tried to swallow, but my tongue burned. I put the cup down and turned away. The scent of the tea lingered, thick and viscous. I turned on the tap and quietly poured the rest down the sink. The water swirled, taking the pale brown liquid away, leaving the mug looking as though it had just recovered from an illness. Evan emerged from his study, phone still in hand. "You don't like it?" "I just tried it. You should trust my mother more. She reads widely. She knows things. Everything she does is for us." The word us sounded alien to me. Between us, that word seemed only to be used for justification. I washed the cup, leaving a faint clink. He stood behind me in silence, then turned back to his room. I looked around the kitchen, a small room I once loved. Now, every corner held traces of someone else. The fruit basket, the tea boxes, the crystal bracelet on the shelf. Everything was arranged beautifully, meticulously. Exactly what people called perfect. I opened the window, letting the sea air rush in. The cold cut through the sweet scent, but only for a moment before the tea smell prevailed again. The air felt heavy. I sat down and wrote a note to myself. Don't confuse concern with ownership. I didn't dare post it anywhere, but folded it up and placed it in a drawer. A text message chimed on my phone. Margaret. "Sleep early, my dear. The tea works better when your heart is at peace." I read it, then placed the phone face down. The words seemed gentle, yet carried the invasive feeling of someone checking my pulse from afar. I went into the living room and looked out the window. The pale moonlight shone onto the yard, drawing long streaks of light. Somewhere the waves were still steady. I sat down on the couch, pulling a blanket around me. In the quiet, I clearly heard every one of my breaths. Not rushed, not faint, just struggling to stay even. On the table, light reflected off the empty teacup, painting a faint circle on the wood surface. I didn't touch it again. A thought crossed my mind. If love needs proof, maybe it isn't love anymore. I stood up and turned off the light. In the darkness, the lavender scent remained, clinging to the air, fading slowly like a wish that didn't require a listener. The weight of enforced politeness, marking the fracture between concern and control. Evening. The rain was falling thinly, like threads, tapping against the window frames. In the kitchen, the yellow light was soft but cold, reflecting a long streak across the countertop. I was washing dishes when the phone rang, a familiar number. I dried my hands and answered. "Have you tried the uterus yoga yet?" Margaret's voice was clear and steady. The question cut straight into the air, making me shiver. I stood still for a few seconds, looking at the water droplets clinging to my fingers. "Yes, I have tried it," I said, so softly it sounded like a sigh. A small, neat, quiet lie, but I could feel it dropping between us, creating a thin, razor-sharp distance. Margaret inhaled on the other end, exhaling with the sound of a smile. "Good. I knew it. Be persistent, dear. All it takes is faith." "Yes," I answered briefly, like someone reading a familiar script. "I'll send more tea tomorrow. This kind is very effective. Remember to drink it regularly." "Okay." I ended the call. The final beep echoed dryly in the dim kitchen. I looked outside. The blurred rain made the streetlights tremble. I sighed quietly, the weariness not entirely physical. Evan appeared at the kitchen doorway holding a glass of water. He had heard the tail end of the call. "My mother genuinely cares," he said, his voice soft, almost reassuring. I placed the phone on the counter. "Care," I repeated. Sometimes it's just another way for people to reassure themselves. He frowned. "What do you mean?" I turned to look at him. Concern shouldn't make someone feel small. He fell silent. No reaction, no gesture. Only the sound of water dripping from the faucet, each drop hitting the stainless steel sink like a clock skipping a beat. He poured his water, drinking slowly. "You always think the worst of my mother." "No," I said. "I'm just trying to understand why her affection makes me feel measured." Evan breathed out, offering no reply. The light shone across his face, half bright, half shadowed, the dividing line of distance. I turned back to the sink, turning the faucet on harder. The water crashed, washing away a few soap fragments. I watched the flow, wishing it could cleanse the heavy atmosphere around me. He stood behind me, close enough for me to feel his warmth, but not touching. "You should be grateful," he said quietly, a subtle reprimand. I smiled faintly, without turning around. Grateful for being taught how to breathe? He didn't reply. I heard him walking away, the floorboards groaning softly under his steps. When the study door closed, the kitchen grew darker. I turned off the tap and took a towel to dry my hands. Cold water still clung to my wrist, running down onto my palms, chilling my skin. I sat down on a chair, leaning back, listening to the rain outside change its rhythm. On the counter, my teacup still held half its contents. I picked it up and took a tentative sip. The bitterness spread instantly, darker than last night, sharp, like advice repeated too many times. I put the cup down, saying nothing. The herbal scent wafted up, blending with the sound of the rain, making the air thick. I stood up and opened the window. Cold wind rushed in, the damp smell of earth mixing with the tea. I inhaled deeply, but my throat still felt tight. Perhaps it was because what was trapped inside me wasn't the scent, but the voice that had never been heard. I remembered Margaret's hugs, her saying, "Just relax, darling. Love will make everything better." Thinking back now, I felt like a glass held too tightly, not broken, but cracked. The clock in the living room chimed 8. Evan hadn't returned. I gathered the dishes, washed them quickly, then wiped the table. Everything returned to order, exactly as they wished. On the counter, the note I had written was still there. Don't confuse concern with ownership. I looked at it for a moment, then folded it and tucked it into my shirt pocket. Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind still blew, carrying the cold air of the night. I turned off the main lights, leaving only the hallway lamp on. The light slid across the room, painting a dividing line on the wall. Light and dark, inside and out, love and control. I stood watching it for a while, then whispered under my breath, "Not everyone who says they love you wants you to be free." The kitchen was quiet. I heard my own heart again, steady and soft like the hands of a clock. The silence was no longer safe as it was before. It was beginning to take shape. A thin crack ran across my heart, not yet distinct, but I knew it was real. Dinner was quiet. The soft clink of a knife on a plate, the wind sliding past the glass outside, the scent of grilled fish and lemon hung in the air, but neither of us was eating. Evan sat opposite me, reading something on his phone, the blue light casting a cold, vacant glow on his cheekbones. I watched the wall clock. The minute hand clicked along slowly. Finally, I spoke. "I want to go back for another checkup tomorrow. Keller scheduled more blood tests." He looked up, his expression briefly showing surprise before settling into a faint smile. "I've already had a child, Claire." His voice carried a trace of disdain, as if discussing a topic long settled and irrelevant. I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" He shrugged, put his phone down and poured more water. "I'm just stating the truth. With Lydia." In that instant, the space seemed to freeze.
the sound of a spoon hitting the glass, cold metal, my heart fracturing. The sound was short, quiet, but I heard it distinctly, like something breaking inside my chest. "Say that again?" I asked, my voice strangely normal. Evan rested his hands on the table, his fingers tapping a rhythm. "I thought you knew. She left before the baby was born, but I know I have a child." I sat immobile. Rain began to fall lightly outside, blending with the sound of the wind. I felt the air grow heavy, as if everything in the house had just been subtly rearranged. "Are you sure?" I asked, trying to find some semblance of calm in my voice. He turned away, looking out the window. "She never said otherwise." The answer was short, thin, but heavy as lead. I looked at my hands on the table. My knuckles were white from gripping them tightly. There were too many things I wanted to say, but they wouldn't pass my throat. In my head, I heard an invisible click, like someone locking a door from the inside. "And you believed her?" I asked. "Lydia isn't the type to lie." "And I am?" Evan looked up. "You always question everything."
I'm tired of it. I laughed, a sound that barely formed. "No, I'm just starting to learn how to listen again." No one spoke another word. The rain intensified, slashing against the window pane, forming a rapid beat. I poured water, holding the glass with both hands to keep myself from shaking. The coldness seeped through my skin, spreading into my bones. He lowered his head and ate, taking small, slow, precise bites, as if dinner were perfectly normal. I watched him, trying to find the face of the man who once shared long mornings and promises of a home with me. Now everything felt alien, like two people living in the same room but in two different worlds. I cleared the plates. He didn't offer to help, just said, "Don't overthink it, Claire. The past is the past." I heard him but didn't reply. To me, the past wasn't over. It was still alive, still breathing in every moment of silence. While washing the dishes, I accidentally dropped the spoon. The metallic sound rang out, echoed off the walls, and died quickly. A tiny scratch appeared on the tile floor, thin but clearly visible. I bent down, touched it, my fingertips stinging slightly. I knew no one else would see this tiny fissure but me. I dried my hands, leaning against the sink. The rain had stopped and the wind blew gently. Evan was still sitting at the table, on his phone, as if the conversation had never taken place. "Have you ever considered," I asked, "that sometimes people believe something simply because they're afraid of it being untrue?" He didn't look up. "Are you philosophizing now?" "No, I'm just talking about us." Evan sighed. "I don't want to argue." "Neither do I replied. "I just want to understand." I walked past him, grabbing a cloth to wipe the table. He remained seated, the light from his screen reflected in his eyes. Two small halos that didn't reach me. I spoke softly. "I think if you really do have a child out there, you should at least know for sure." He looked up. "And if I don't?" I paused, looking at him. "Then perhaps this is the first time you'll have to live with your own truth." The air was thick. I heard my breathing mix with the sound of the air conditioning. Evan stood up, scraping his chair, his footsteps fading away. I watched the study door close, the light inside still casting a long yellow streak. I sat down on his chair, picked up the cool teacup, and inhaled deeply. The herbal scent was bitter, no longer pleasant. On the table, fragments of light from the lamp reflected on the water's surface in the glass, flickering and breaking apart. The house returned to silence, leaving only the clocks ticking and my tired breath. Sometimes I think silence isn't peace. It's just enough distance so that people don't have to hear each other shatter. I didn't sleep that night. The wind whistled past the window, a long, sharp sound like a blade skimming the edge of glass. I lay still, the comforter pulled up to my chest, my eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. Light from the street lamp filtered through the curtains, leaving a faint orange streak. The room was cold, smelling of dampness and sea salt. Evan slept with his back to me. His breathing was even, slow, sounding like a distant running machine. The distance between us was only an arm's length, but I knew I couldn't reach him anymore. I placed my hand on my abdomen. My palm was warm, but the skin underneath was cold. The feeling of emptiness was like the room around me, vast, clean, and devoid of life. I inhaled deeply, trying to find a second heartbeat, but only heard the wind. Perhaps I am the fault of everything. The thought floated by, as light as a breath, yet it was enough to make me choke. It wasn't the first time I'd thought it, but tonight the statement had form and weight, as if it had been written down by someone and placed inside my mind. I turned, looking out the window. The sky was black, the wind bending the pine branches sharply. After a moment, I heard the window latch rattle gently, a steady rhythm, like a reminder. Someone was still out there, but they wouldn't tell me where I belonged. When the clock struck midnight, Evan shifted, his hand briefly touching the edge of the bed. I didn't react. The touch was unintentional, like someone subconsciously reaching for the familiar in a dream. I let it be. I remembered his words. I've already had a child. The word already in that sentence echoed like an ending to faith. No proof was needed, only the way he said it. I closed my eyes, listening to my heartbeat, each pulse like the drip of water. I thought about our early years, when we would talk late into the night, when one cup of coffee could stretch through the entire morning. Now every conversation ended in silence. The wind still howled through the gap in the door, creating a long, sustained whistle. I shot up, went to the window, and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the night was so dark there was no horizon. I gently released the latch. The wind rushed in, bone-chilling, lifting the corner of the comforter. I stood there for a moment, letting the cold wash over me, until my eyes started to sting. I closed it again, locking the latch. The scent of salt still clung to the air. I returned to bed and looked at Evan. He was still asleep, his face peaceful, but the peace of someone who had run out of energy. I suddenly thought, maybe he was also tired of having to defend something he wasn't sure was true. I lay down, pulling the blanket up to my shoulders. The empty feeling in my chest spread slowly to my abdomen. I placed my hand there again, this time not out of yearning, but to confirm my own existence. I thought of Margaret, of her calls, her advice, her boxes of tea. Each gesture was like a thin coat of paint on a wall, beautiful, polished, and making it harder for me to breathe. "You just need to believe," she'd said on the phone one day. Believe in what? In the man who couldn't look at me when speaking the truth? Or in the person who only offered silence when I needed an answer? I opened my eyes, looking at the ceiling. The light from outside was cast onto it in a faint rectangle. I realized it resembled the empty picture frame, except this time, I didn't want to fill it anymore. Beside me, Evan stirred. He let out a deep, heavy sigh. I suddenly wanted to touch his shoulder, just to ask, why? But my hand paused in midair, then dropped. I wasn't sure if what I wanted was an answer, or just a sign that he still heard me. The room was silent, only the wind remaining. In my mind, a small voice echoed, "Sometimes, faith doesn't die in a single betrayal. It fades away in the prolonged silence." I didn't know if I came up with that line or heard it from someone else, but I believed it. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but just to lie there and wait for dawn. Outside, the wind weakened, leaving the sound of the distant sea. A steady, deep sound that reminded me that the world kept going, even as everything inside me was coming to a stop. When the first light of dawn crept past the edge of the curtains, I saw dust motes floating, slow and deliberate. I realized that the fracture probably didn't start tonight, but had been silently blooming for a long time. From the soft words, from the familiar smile, from a bitter cup of tea. I exhaled, whispering in my heart, if there was a fault, it was only that I believed. The afternoon was bleak. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still a slate gray. I was clearing the dining table, folding the cloth, and wiping the water droplets from the wooden surface. Evan had just left, saying he was heading to the studio to finalize a new design. The door closed. His car backed out, leaving behind an empty silence. A moment later, I walked into his study. It was a small room. White light from the window fell onto the desk. His laptop was still open, the screen dimly lit, the cursor blinking. I intended to shut it down, but the keyboard was still warm. He had just used it. I looked at it, like looking at a door that hadn't quite closed. A second of hesitation, and then I sat down. In the project folder, there was a strangely named file, Family. No modification date. I opened it. Dozens of small images appeared, landscapes, a few portraits. I strolled down, stopping at a name, Lydia Summer, Tuscany, 2022. The screen loaded slowly, and the first image became clear. Lydia, a husband, and a laughing child. All three stood under the Italian sun, behind them olive trees, their silver leaves rustling in the wind. My hand trembling, I zoomed in. The child's face was sharp, bright brown hair, light green eyes. Beautiful, but distant. The more I looked, the more I saw a simple, cruel truth. The boy didn't resemble Evan. Not a single feature. Not the eyes, not the line of his smile. I looked over at the man beside Lydia. The new husband's face was an exact match, from the dimples to the tilt of his head. The boy's smile was his replica. I released the mouse and leaned back. The room was so silent that I could hear my own pulse drumming in my ears. My breath came in short gasps. The scent of new plastic from the computer mixed with the old paper smell from the bookshelf. I looked back at the screen. Lydia stood between two men at two different times. One was Evan, who still believed himself to be the child's father. The other was the man who truly belonged in the picture. I felt my mind blank, yet my eyes were bright and cold, as if I had just looked into a mirror. Something inside me was no longer afraid. There was no feeling of injury left, only a thick, quiet layer like ice. I looked at the photo one more time, then scrolled down. There was another picture. Lydia, smiling, her hand resting on the man's shoulder. Below, in the comments section, a few lines in Italian. La mia famiglia, il nostro piccolo miracolo. My family, our little miracle. I touched the screen with my fingertip. The surface was cool. The sensation was both immediate and remote. Outside, the wind blew through the crack in the door. I heard the curtain rustle faintly, just once, then silence. The house seemed to have just realized something had been erased from it. I turned off the screen. The light in the room changed, growing darker. In the reflection on the mirror next to the desk, I saw myself sitting up straight, my eyes never leaving my own shadow. No tears, no anger, just a painfully clear realization. Faith can die without a single lie being spoken. I left the desk and walked toward the kitchen. The water in the kettle was still warm. I poured it into a mug but didn't drink. On the surface of the water,
The light bulb reflected as a faint circle, distorted, swaying slightly every time I breathed. I sat down, my hands resting on the table. The feeling was like observing my own marriage from outside a pane of glass, seeing everything clearly, but unable to touch it. In my mind, I heard his voice again from yesterday. I've already had a child. That sentence, when unverified, was just a suspicion. But now, with the image before me, it became proof of a non-existent thing. I opened my journal and quickly scribbled a few lines, not to remember, but to keep from going insane. If a man can lie to himself long enough, he will forget what is true. The ink bled slightly, the words soaking into the paper.
I closed the journal, not wanting to look anymore. On the wall, the clock struck 4. The sound was steady and indifferent. I looked out the window, the sky gray, the light obscured by clouds. For a moment, I thought I was looking at the marriage itself, still holding light, but completely overshadowed. Evan will return, and he will say the usual, "Don't worry about it, you're just imagining things." I knew his answer beforehand, and his tone, but this time, I wouldn't ask to hear it again. I stood up and closed the laptop. My finger touched the keyboard one last time. It was still warm, as if he had just left his mark. But that warmth no longer made me feel close. It made me feel like I was sitting between two worlds, the one he spoke and the one I had just seen. I turned off the light. The room was submerged in the gray of dusk. In that darkness, I clearly heard every gust of wind, every beat of my heart, every small piece of faith that had just fractured. I don't know what I will do next. I only know that, for the first time in years, I feel strangely sober. I sat motionless in front of the screen. The blue light shone on my face, cold and flat like winter lake water. I didn't cry. I just sat and breathed, feeling the fog in my head dissipate. Everything became painfully clear. There was no room left for imagination, only the truth, stark and indifferent. I moved the mouse and clicked save. I saved the photo, proof and liberation all at once. A tiny file, less than 2 megabytes, yet it carried the weight of an entire marriage. I renamed the file truth.jpg and dragged it into a separate folder, hidden among hundreds of his work-related images. Outside, the rain returned. The wind beat against the window, each gust growing stronger. I closed the laptop and stood up. The house felt like a body struggling to breathe. The sound of the wind was its heartbeat, the creaking floorboards its tired joints. I walked down the hall, touching the wall lightly to maintain my balance. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen counter, a small lamp on, staring at the cold teacup. The steam was long gone, but the bitter smell remained. I thought of all the times I had kept silent, each one a dull stab, not killing, just numbing. When the first light crept into the kitchen, I stood up. This morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Evan walked in, his hair still damp from the shower, his tie unknotted. "Up early?" he asked. I placed the laptop on the table. The screen was open. The photo displayed large and clear. I looked at him, my voice calm. "Do you recognize this face?" He frowned, walking closer. In his eyes, the reflection from the screen darkened his pupils. He looked for a long time, then lifted his gaze. "Did you violate my privacy?" The question dropped like shattered glass. I smiled faintly. "Your privacy contained a lie about my life. Perhaps we merged our privacy a long time ago." He took a step back. "You don't understand, Claire. That's old history." "No, Evan. Old history doesn't mean it's untrue." You said you had a child. But that boy is not yours. I don't blame you for the past. I just want to know why you needed to sustain a falsehood." He pressed his lips together, saying nothing. After a moment, he sat down on the chair, resting his elbows on the table. "Because I wanted my mother to be proud. Because I didn't want her to think I failed. Lydia left, and my mother saw it as a disgrace. When Lydia had the child, I just said that to make it go away." I looked at him, a strange feeling creeping over me. The man across from me was no longer threatening, just pathetic. "Did you truly believe a lie could sustain a lifelong faith?" He didn't answer, only a long sigh, like a slowly snapping rope. I sat opposite him. The morning light slanted through the window, dividing the table into two halves, him in the light, me in the shadow. "You once said I wasn't grateful, but perhaps the only thing I need to be thankful for is the truth." He looked up, his eyes tired. "Are you going to tell my mother?" "No. She will find out herself, as all people do when they cling to something too fragile." Evan sat still, his face cycling through expressions: surprise, frustration, then emptiness. He reached out to close the laptop, but I stopped him. "Don't. You need to look at it one more time. Not for me, but for you." He paused, then withdrew his hand. We sat in silence, neither of us speaking. The clock ticked in the kitchen, each beat cold. I felt lighter, not because of a victory, but because I no longer had to hold on. I spoke softly. "Do you know what the saddest thing about this is, Evan? It's not that you lied. It's that I believed it to the extent that I didn't realize I was living someone else's dream." He looked at me, his mouth opening then closing. I knew he couldn't find any words left. Outside, the wind softened. The light shone on the wall, casting our shadows. Two people, two shapes that no longer matched. I took the laptop, closed the lid, and put it in a drawer. My voice was low. "From now on, you can keep your story. I will keep the rest." He nodded slightly, offering no protest. Perhaps he knew that any argument after the truth was meaningless. I grabbed my jacket, preparing to leave the house. As my hand touched the doorknob, I stopped, without turning around. "I didn't violate your privacy, Evan. I just took back a part of my life." I opened the door. The cold wind rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and earth. A morning like any other, but to me it was the first morning in years that I felt I was truly breathing. Behind me, the house was silent. I heard the door close, and my heart open. The next morning began with silence. No sound of the kettle boiling, no smell of coffee. Only the pale light filtering through the curtains, sweeping a long streak across the wooden floor. I sat at the dining table, my arms folded across my chest. Evan walked out of the bedroom, his dress shirt wrinkled, his tie held loosely in his hand. We looked at each other, saying nothing. The distance between us wasn't great, but I could distinctly feel the cold radiating from it. He opened the cabinet, took a glass, and poured water. Every movement was slow, as if he were trying to maintain composure for a battle that would erupt in the quiet. I spoke first, my voice hoarse after a sleepless night. "I only retrieved the piece of truth you hid." He paused, without turning around. The sound of running water stopped abruptly. A few seconds later, he set the glass down, silent, then spoke softly. "You're crossing a line." I looked at his back. "Which line, Evan? The line of truth, or the line of things you're afraid to face?" He turned, his eyes strained, his jaw clenched. "You don't understand. Everyone has their reasons." I nodded gently. "And I'm just asking,
What reason is compelling enough to build an entire life on a lie? The air in the room thickened. I could hear the wind outside scraping across the roof tiles, a dry, whistling sound. He sat down, his hands clasped together. I didn't try to hurt you. I know. You only tried to protect your image. I spoke softly, as a statement, not an accusation. But that doesn't make it any better than using a lie to restrain me. Evan looked up. In the dim light, his eyes were wet. I couldn't tell if it was from anger or fear. Do you think you're better? You always want to control emotions. You want everything to be exactly as you envision. I laughed, a small, weary sound. If I could truly control everything, I wouldn't be sitting here, Evan. He fell silent. His lips were pressed tightly together.
I saw his hand tremble slightly, but he didn't pull it back. A drop of water from the glass condensed onto the table, spreading into a small ring. I wiped it with a napkin, no longer looking at him. The only sound left in the space was the clock ticking, slow and dry. The faint scent of yesterday's coffee still lingered, cold, bitter, and devoid of flavor. Evan spoke softly. What are you going to do with those photos? I'm not going to do anything, I replied. The truth doesn't need to be used as a weapon. It just needs to be seen. He exhaled, lowered his head, then stood up. I'm going to work. I didn't try to stop him. As he walked past, the scent of his cologne mixed with the dampness of his shirt lingered. I watched him button his shirt, the movement slow, like someone preparing to leave a place that was once home, but is now just a temporary shelter. Before opening the door, he turned back. You've changed. No, I replied. I just stopped trying to be someone else. He said no more, just nodded and left. The sound of the door closing, then complete silence. The house was absolutely quiet. I stood in the kitchen, listening to my own heart beat. That rhythm, for the first time in years, did not synchronize with anyone else's. I cleared the table, collecting the glass he had just used. It still held half a glass of water, the light shining through it, creating a thin band of light on the wood surface. I looked at it, seeing my own reflection within, distorted, small, but real. I poured the water into the sink and washed the glass. The running water was steady, like the house's slow breath. On the table, the cold coffee cup remained, light shining on its surface, shattering into glistening fragments. I stared for a long time, until the light changed color, fading to yellow, then dissolving. The familiar morning had finally disappeared. There was no argument, no shouting, only silence. The silence of someone who has just removed the final rope from around their neck. I sat down on the chair, taking a deep breath. In that moment, I realized something strange. Liberation doesn't roar. It doesn't require shouting or slammed doors. It's just a very quiet morning where people stop needing to explain themselves. I took out my pen and wrote a line in my journal. Freedom isn't leaving. It's when you no longer want to return. I closed the journal, placing it on the table next to the coffee cup. The wind outside gently swayed the curtains. The light shifted one last time, shining on the empty tabletop. I smiled, not out of happiness, but because my heart had finally fallen quiet. The afternoon descended slowly. The light from the window slid across the floor, reflecting onto the wall in thin, blade-like streaks. The air inside the house was so still that I could clearly hear the clock ticking from the living room. One chime, then another. I sat at the table, waiting. Precisely at 4 o'clock, the knock came, 3 familiar taps. I knew who it was without looking. When I opened the door, Margaret stood there, holding a small box. The lid was tied with a white ribbon, and a faint pink glow emanated from within. I brought the Fertility Blessing Stone. They say it helps balance energy, she said, her voice sweet like the scent of faded roses. I stepped aside, inviting her in.
She walked slowly, her coat an ivory color, her shoes matching, as if her very color palette was meant to remind others that she belonged to a world of purity. She placed the box on the table, untied the bow, and opened the lid. The pink stone glittered, its surface smooth as a child's skin. "Isn't it beautiful?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with conviction. I looked at it for a moment, then spoke softly. "It is beautiful, but I think today we should talk about something else." She looked up. "Oh?" I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "Margaret, we need to talk." She smiled, the kind of smile she was used to employing when things started to slip from her control. "What is it, dear?" I opened my bag and took out my laptop. The screen flashed on, the image immediately visible. The blue light reflected on the table, making the room feel a degree colder. I turned the screen toward her. In the photo was Lydia, her new husband, and the child smiling under the golden sun. I said nothing. I just let her look. Margaret stared intently at the screen, her eyes narrowing. "Who took this picture?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that the child in this photo is not your grandson." I spoke slowly, each word dropping heavily like the stone she had brought. She looked up,
her lips trembling slightly. "What are you talking about?" I pushed the laptop closer. "Your son never had a child." The direction of the air in the room shifted. Wind from outside rushed through the door crack, lifting a tissue off the table. I placed a printed copy of the photo on the table. The corner touched the edge of the stone, creating a small, clear click, like a final punctuation mark. Margaret reached out to pick up the stone but stopped halfway. The afternoon light streamed through the window, illuminating her face. I saw the fine lines around her eyes contract, not from age, but from something deeper. Denial starting to crack. "Evan told me he had a child," she said, her voice shaking but trying to maintain composure. "You shouldn't believe things you see on the internet. That is not the internet. It's a real photo from his own folder." She stood still, her eyes blinking rapidly, as if blinking could make everything disappear. "Nonsense. Lydia, she told me that." I interrupted. "Perhaps you heard what you wanted to believe, not what was actually said." The atmosphere was thick. For a few seconds, all I heard was the wind and her strained breathing. Margaret's hand dropped and the stone fell onto the table, rolled once and stopped in front of me. That sound, small, clear, made the entire house tremble. She spoke faintly, almost breathlessly. "Does Evan know?" I told him. He knows. He fell silent. Margaret sat down on the chair, her head slightly bowed. The light slanted across her hair. The pink glow of the stone reflected on her cheekbone, making her look like she was sitting in a soft flame. But that fire warmed no one. "I did not come here to hurt you," I said. "I just don't want to continue pretending that everything is intact." She let out a dry, hacking laugh, brittle like old paper. "You think I didn't know? I just wanted to believe. Because if I believed, I could still hold on to something." I sat opposite her, silent. Another gust of wind blew through, stirring the curtains. In that moment, I saw no more imposition in her eyes, only the emptiness of someone who had just looked into a reversed mirror. "Evan, he is weak," she said, quieter now. "Like his father. I thought protecting him was the way to save the family. But perhaps I was just forcing everyone to live in their own shadows." Neither of us said anything further. The light turned yellow, then faded. I gently closed the laptop, leaving the stone and the photo lying side by side. Two seemingly opposite objects that were essentially the same. Cold, hard, and transparent. Margaret stood up. Her hand trembled as she picked up her bag, but her voice steadied. Thank you for telling me the truth. I nodded. As she walked toward the door, the last of the afternoon light touched her shoulder, faint and thin. The door closed, leaving the room quiet. On the table, the stone still reflected the light. That pink glow was now cold as glass. No longer a blessing, but only a witness to the truth that had just been exposed. I sat there for a long time, listening to the wind outside change its rhythm. In my heart there was no joy, only the lightness of something that had finally been put down. The air in the house was heavy and thick. The last of the afternoon light hadn't quite faded, mixing with the gray color of the walls. I stood at the kitchen doorway, listening to Margaret's sharp, shallow breaths in the living room. She was sitting on a chair, her hands clasped, her head slightly bowed. The photo I had left was in front of her. It can't be. Margaret's hands trembled. Her lips moved silently, her voice barely a whisper. The photo shook in her grasp, then slipped onto the floor. I didn't pick it up. I just stood still, watching the light stream from the window onto her face. The face of someone who had just seen the one thing she had spent her entire life trying to avoid. The clock ticked, steady and dry, the truth gnawing at the wall of illusions she had built up over the years. Every tick was like a needle piercing through the silence, stitching together the things that couldn't be said. Evan stood beside her chair, his face pale. He looked at his mother, then at me. "Mom," he said softly, but Margaret didn't respond. She was only looking down at the pink stone on the table, the light reflecting from it into her eyes, making them glisten as if holding water. "Mother," Evan said louder, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Don't believe her." I raised an eyebrow. "Her?" He turned back, his eyes clouded. "You are hurting my mother," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. I didn't step back. "You hurt me every single day." I stood tall, without tears. The air recoiled, becoming silent enough to hear the clock hand sweep to the next minute. Evan clenched his fist. "You don't understand. She only wanted to help. Mom is not at fault." I kept my voice level. "No one said she is at fault, but you are. Because you chose to let your lie become someone else's faith." Margaret looked up, her eyes full of water, but they didn't spill. "Evan," she said, her voice faint. "Tell me the truth." He avoided her gaze. "There's nothing to tell." It's all in the past. But do you have the child? The question broke free, as thin as a snapping thread. Evan fell silent. The hand on her shoulder trembled slightly, then withdrew. The answer lay in the silence. And that very silence was what ended all assumptions. Margaret let out a sharp breath, leaning back against the chair. Her face was white, her mouth slightly open, but no sound came out. The last of the afternoon light fell across her forehead, exposing every fine line, slender grooves like cracks in an old mirror. I stepped forward, picked up the fallen photo from the floor, wiped off the dust, and placed it back on the table. No one wants to hurt you, Margaret, but sometimes the truth is the only way for a mother to truly see who her child is. She looked at me, her eyes no longer angry, just tired. You think I didn't know? I just wasn't brave enough to believe otherwise. I remained silent. In that moment, I saw the woman who had once terrified me shrink. No longer a controller, just a mother desperately trying to hold on to the last fragment of her belief. Evan turned away, his voice hoarse. Don't listen to her, Mom. That doesn't matter. Margaret placed her hands on the table, slowly shaking her head. No, Evan. It does matter. What matters is that you chose silence." The statement froze him. He turned, about to say something, but swallowed it back. I watched the scene, feeling my own chest lighten. Perhaps sometimes no one needs to win. The fog just needs to lift so everyone can see each other clearly. Margaret unclasped her old wedding ring, turning it between her fingers. "I used to think love meant holding tight," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Now I understand. True love is daring to let go, even when you're afraid." No one answered. The clock still ticked, slow and steady. Evan sat down on the chair, burying his face in his hands.
The room was left with only the sound of the wind outside the door and the tired breathing of 3 people. I walked over, closed the laptop, and placed my hand on the cold wooden tabletop. The pink stone remained there, reflecting a faint light. What was once a symbol of faith was now only the evidence of a collapse. I spoke softly, almost a whisper. "No lie is worth forcing a mother to live in fear." Margaret nodded, her gaze distant. "Thank you, Claire." When she stood up and took my hand, I was surprised by the feel of it, warm and trembling. A long breath escaped between us. There were no battle lines anymore, only 2 women carrying cracks in different places. Evan looked up, his eyes red. "Are both of you against me?" I answered slowly, "No. We just stopped standing on the side of the untruth." He looked at his mother, then at me, his lips pressed together, saying nothing more. The light on the wall turned pale yellow. The afternoon was nearly over. In the steady rhythm of the clock, I clearly heard my heart calm down, not because of forgiveness, but because finally, the truth had found a place to rest. No one left their spot. The air in the room was thick like smoke. Margaret looked at the 2 of us, a mixture of tears and shame. Her face was pallid, the makeup smudged around her eyes, revealing the true weariness of age and illusion. Evan still stood behind the chair, his hands clenched around the wooden frame. He avoided looking at me, as if confronting me for one more second would allow the truth to pierce his skin. Margaret tried to press her lips together, but a sob escaped. Short, dry, and out of tune. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her hand trembling. "I don't know who to believe anymore," she said, her voice like tattered silk. "All my life, I only wanted to hold on to something, to avoid feeling useless." "Hold on by forcing others to believe the same thing?" I asked gently. There was no intent to offend, only an honest question. She fell silent. The afternoon light slanted through the door, sweeping across the floor. Dust motes in the air appeared clearly, like fine snow. Evan turned his back, his shoulders hunched. "Enough," he said quietly. "Mom doesn't need to hear anymore." I looked at him. "No, Evan. It is precisely because she deserves to hear it that we are here." He turned back, his eyes clouded. "What else do you want?" "Nothing," I replied. "Only that you stop using other people to hide your own flaws." Evan gasped for air, as if drowning. "You always think you're right." "No," I said. "I just stopped being afraid of being wrong." A silence. Only the clock ticking. A sound so thin it seemed capable of cutting the air. Margaret stood up, steadying herself on the back of the chair. "Both of you, stop it," she said hoarsely. "No one wins in this." I nodded. Yes, no one wins. But at least, now we don't have to pretend anymore. She sat back down, her head bowed, her hands intertwined. For a fleeting moment, I saw a different mother. Small,
exposed, stripped of the layers she'd worn during the years she believed she was strong. Evan reached for the glass of water on the table, perhaps to end the conversation, but his hand trembled. The glass slipped, shattering. The sound was loud, sharp, spreading like a small explosion. Water splashed out, hitting the edge of Margaret's dress, a few drops landing on my wrist. Everyone froze, looking at the broken fragments scattered across the floor. That sound of breaking felt like the final period. Evan bent down, mumbling, "I'm sorry," but no one answered. I took a tissue, bent to pick up the shards of glass, placing each piece carefully into my palm. They were cold, slippery, and bright. When I stood up, the fragments briefly reflected my face, distorted, yet clearer than ever. I look at Margaret. We don't need charms. We only need the truth. She looked up, tears falling, but a small smile forming. "Perhaps you're right," she murmured, her voice sounding like it was pulled from deep within the earth. "The truth hurts, but it breathes." Evan sank into the chair, his head bowed low. He raised his hands to cover his eyes, saying indistinctly, "You win." I shook my head. This isn't about winning or losing, Evan. This is the first time we've heard each other's true voices. No one spoke again. The room was empty, but no longer stifling. The scent of water, dust, and the old lavender from the stone mingled, a chaotic yet real mixture. I opened the window. The wind from outside rushed in, the sound of freedom echoing in the house for the first time. The curtain lifted, then fell, tracing soft movements like a breath. The water on the floor reflected the gray sky, glistening like broken glass, trying to return to its original form. Margaret closed her eyes, listening. Evan still sat, his back slumped, his arms dangling. I stood between them, saying nothing, just taking a deep breath. Outside, the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks. The wind swept through the hallway, touched the wall, creating a low, warm sound.
Like a heartbeat, slowing down after a storm. In that moment, I understood. Collapse doesn't require shouting, doesn't require tragedy. It only requires a silence deep enough for people to realize they are still alive. I stepped back, closing the window, leaving just enough space for the wind to seep through the crack. The last light of the day shone into the room, not harsh, not dim, just enough to see that 3 people were still there, learning to breathe again, after a devastation no one wished for. The morning after the storm, there was no more sound of argument, only the smell of dampness in the wood and the lingering scent of cold coffee from the day before. The light filtered through the curtains, thin and steady, like a knife cut across the silent space. I sat at the table. In front of me, the prepared divorce papers. The first blank sheet of paper reflected a faint light, allowing me to see my own face within it, calm, slightly pale, but no longer afraid. Evan walked in, still in his gray shirt, his hair a little messy. He stopped at the doorway, his gaze searching, as if the house no longer belonged to him. "You're up early," he said. I nodded, not looking up. "I have something that needs to be done." He looked down at the table, recognizing the papers. He didn't ask, but his eyes were instantly guarded. "What is this?" I spun the pen, letting the tip touch the edge of the paper, hearing a very faint shush sound. "I've decided." He gave a small, dry, stiff laugh. "Are you kidding me?" "No." I put the pen down. "I choose to live." The air between us compressed. Outside, the wind crept through the porch, hitting the wind chime. A clear, cold sound like metal dropping into water. Evan placed his hands on the table. "Claire, this doesn't have to go this far. We just had a misunderstanding." I looked at him. A 10-year-long misunderstanding? He fell silent, his eyes directed toward the window. "I tried my best." "You tried to save your image, not me." Evan sighed, taking a step back. You will regret this. Divorce is not just paperwork. It erases everything we ever had. I shrugged. Maybe. But staying also erases me. A single sentence dropped into the room like a small stone, making no noise, only a spreading aftershock. Evan bent down, his hands gripping the edge of the table, then releasing. I always thought you were weak, he said, his voice smaller. But it turns out, you only needed to be silent long enough to turn what you wanted into a decision. I didn't reply. I opened the pen and gently drew the first line of ink. The paper trembled slightly. The sound of the pen gliding sounded like a bird taking flight from the doorway. He watched, not daring to come closer. Do you know what this means? It's the end. I smiled faintly. No, it's the beginning. Outside, the sun rose. Light streamed onto the table, shining through the paper as the ink dried. I put the pen down, looking up at him. Evan stood there, his eyes unblinking. Something inside him collapsed, not loudly, just an empty space that opened up, and he didn't know how to fill it. I didn't think you would actually do it, he said, his voice almost a croak. I didn't think I could either, until this morning. He laughed weakly. All this over a photo? No. Over 10 years of untruth. A silence. Only the sound of the wind rushing through the crack in the door, bringing the smell of salt. I gathered the papers, placing them into an envelope. My hand trembled slightly, yet strangely my chest felt calm. Evan watched, his gaze both unfamiliar and familiar. The man who once made me believe I was just an extension of him now looked smaller, hollow, and distant. Claire. He spoke my name for the first time in months. Something in his tone made me pause, but I didn't turn around. You're making a mistake. I am simply giving back what you never gave me. Choice. He took a step forward, about to say something else, but I had already put the papers in my bag. No more words were needed. Everything that needed to be said was already contained in the signature. I stood up, leaving the table. As I walked past, the morning light reflected on the tabletop, shining directly onto the ink drops that bled like blood dissolving in water. Pale red, slowly fading, then gone. I stopped for a second, looking at that image. No horror,
No triumph, just the strange feeling of someone being born again through a cut. Evan was silent. He didn't follow, didn't stop me.
I heard him sit down on the chair, his breath heavy, his hand tapping lightly on the table, as if trying to erase the sound that had just occurred. I walked out of the room. The hallway light blinded me momentarily. I heard the window frame rattle gently, the wind chime ring again, softer this time. I inhaled, then exhaled very slowly. In my chest, the old fear was gone. Only a new sound remained, the sound of freedom, small but clear, like the first breath after a long sleep.
Sometimes, freedom begins with a signature and ends with silence. I thought that sentence as the courthouse door closed behind me. Its echo was deep and hollow, like the final chord of a song that had run out of melody. The hallway was long, the stone floor cold. I clearly heard the sound of my shoes hitting the ground, each beat steady, like a heart learning to maintain balance after a disturbance. The folder in my hand felt strangely light now. Just a few sheets of paper, a few lines of text, but heavier than a decade of living in fear. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to look at anyone. Outside, the sun was blazing. Claire stepped out, the sunlight hitting her face, both painful and bright. It was blinding to the point that I had to squint, but also warm enough that I wanted to stand still, allowing my body to absorb the light I once thought I didn't deserve. On the steps, Evan was waiting. White dress shirt, hands tucked into his pockets, his posture adrift.
He looked at me like someone who had lost his bearings in his own house. "It's done?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I nodded. "Done." "That was fast," he said, as if something should have been longer, more painful, or more dramatic. I replied, "When people reach their limit, all that's left is silence." Evan looked down at the steps, smiling faintly. "You seem overly confident." "I'm not confident," I said. "I've just finally chosen to stand on my own side." A gust of wind blew through, tossing a few strands of hair. Both of us fell silent. We stood there in the sun, like two strangers who accidentally meet after many years, knowing each other too well for there to be anything left to say. Evan suddenly spoke, his voice level but strained. "We still have something to discuss." I turned unsurprised. "What is it?" "The house." He enunciated every word clearly. "It was purchased after the wedding. Legally." I cut him off gently but decisively. "The house is in my parents' names. I only lived there." He froze. His face changed color, as if his skin was stretched thin to hide the shock. "Are you joking?" "No. They bought it before I married you, titled it in their names and lent it to me to live in. All the documents are right here." I opened my bag, took out a copy of the deed and placed it in his hand. Evan looked down, his eyes scanning the letters. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The blood color on his cheekbones slowly receded. The wall of power collapsed in silence. He inhaled sharply, then said softly, "You planned this too?" "No," I replied evenly. "I just learned not to let others hold what is mine." Evan looked up, his gaze a mix of disappointment and anger. "So this is truly the end?" "Nothing is ending. Only a person is leaving," I said, then gently folded the documents and hugged them to my chest. He stood still, watching me as if trying to find some fissure in my decision. But there were no more cracks. I had sealed everything, not with hatred but with quiet resolve. A long minute passed. The wind swirled through the hallway, bringing the sound of dry leaves hitting the steps. I heard a bell chime in the distance, perhaps from the small church near the sea. Evan spoke, his voice low. "I didn't think you had the courage to go through with it." I smiled but didn't turn back. "It's not courage, Evan. It's exhaustion." He gave a dry laugh, the sound swallowed by the wind. "You won." "I didn't win. I just stopped losing." He said nothing further. His eyes looked toward the sun as if trying to find something residual there. I looked, then stepped down the stairs. Each step felt like shedding an old skin, the layer of fear, of performance, of days spent forcing the right smile. At the bottom of the steps, I paused. The sun shone on my shoulder, golden and real. No more cold, no more shadow. I turned my head to look back just to confirm that this memory truly existed. The image of the man standing between shadow and light, no longer commanding, only silent. I turned away. The first breath after walking past the courthouse gate felt like opening a new space. The smell of the sea, the sound of the wind, and a sense of lightness in my chest. The first sentence of that morning still echoed in my mind. Sometimes, freedom begins with a signature and ends with silence. But this time I understood one more half, and from that silence, one can begin to truly live. That afternoon, the house was strangely quiet. No more familiar footsteps. No more clink of a coffee cup hastily placed on the table each morning. Only the wind passing by the porch, carrying the scent of dry jasmine from the old vase. I sat at the kitchen counter, the paperwork neatly stacked in front of me. Shared finances, separate assets. Everything was now reduced to small numbers and line items. I never thought two people's lives could be summarized in just a few pages like this. Evan walked in, holding an untouched glass of water. He looked at the documents, then at me. "More division?" Just for clarity, I replied, my voice level. No one owes anyone anything. He sat down opposite me, his gaze disconnected. What about the house? I opened my bag, took out a document proving ownership, and placed it in the middle of the table. These are the original papers. You can look. He took them, his fingers touching the edge of the paper like someone touching something hot. His eyes scanned the text, then stopped mid-sentence. A heavy sigh escaped him. What do I have left? He whispered. The question sounded like it wasn't addressed to me, but to himself. I looked at him, longer than usual. A bag of pink stones, and a costly lesson. He looked up, his eyes empty. You're so cruel. I'm just honest, I said. You call it cruel, I call it sobriety. The sentence dropped onto the table, cold. Between us was the distance of two people who once slept side by side, but no longer knew who was breathing with whom. Evan leaned back in the chair, rubbing his forehead. I don't know where I went wrong. I was silent, not replying. Not because there was nothing to say, but because it had been said too many times over 10 years. Some mistakes aren't in the action, but in the prolonged silence. The kind of silence that makes one believe they are right. He put the glass of water down. The sound was small, but in the empty house it echoed like the final knock on a door.
Are you really leaving? He asked.
I'm not leaving, I replied, my voice slow. I'm just returning to where I belonged. He looked around the house, his gaze sweeping across every item. The wooden chair he once fixed, the wall I once repainted, the curtains I chose when winter came. All of it was still there, only the us was gone. I stood up, walked to the shelf, and opened the inner compartment. Inside was something I had kept for years, the empty picture frame. It had been bought for the future family photo Evan promised we would take in the fall of our first year. But that fall passed, then 9 more, and the frame remained empty. We had hung it in the living room, a constant, unfulfilled reminder. Now I picked it up, feeling its strange lightness. Evan asked, "What are you going to do with that?" I turned back, smiling very slightly. Keep it. To remember that not every frame needs a picture. He said nothing. I saw his eyes follow my every movement, but he lacked the strength to stop me. I walked toward the door. The afternoon sun slanted across the yard, golden and soft. I stood for a moment, letting the light cover my shoulders, then looked back at the house one last time. In the doorway, he was still sitting there, small in the shadow. On the table, the papers lay still, a few sheets slightly askew, as if the wind had just passed through. I took a breath, then stepped out, the frame reflecting my shadow against the afternoon sun. The light hit the glass, creating a thin line, half bright, half dark, like the boundary between the old self and the new. I kept walking without looking back. My shadow stretched out on the small path, then blended into the sunset. All sounds behind me gradually faded. The closing door, the rustling wind, the sound of a house learning to exist without its old owners. In my heart there was no joy, only the feeling of crossing a different threshold, where freedom was no longer a concept, but the very air touching my skin.
The morning in the courtroom, sunlight slanted through the large panes of glass, illuminating the wooden benches where I sat. The smell of fresh wood, the clicking of high heels, and the rustle of papers blended together, creating the specific soundscape of mornings reserved for justice, clean, yet cold. In the front, the row of people was silent. Evan sat at the table opposite, his dress shirt stiff, his hair neatly combed, his eyes fixed forward, as if trying to maintain the last shred of dignity. Margaret sat behind him, her head bowed. The light touched her hands, which were tightly clasped on her lap. I took a deep breath. Claire was suing for emotional manipulation and medical harassment.
not for revenge, but to reestablish boundaries. Boundaries that had been erased during the years spent living with people who always claimed they only wanted what was best for me. My lawyer, a woman with brown hair, leaned over and whispered, "Stay calm. Just speak the truth. Nothing more is needed." I nodded. That was the only thing I had brought here, the truth. Uncolored, unscented, unadorned. When the judge signaled to begin, the room became so quiet that the sound of the pen tapping on the wooden table was clearly audible. Evan stood up first. His voice was low, steady, trying to maintain composure. He spoke of misunderstanding, of love, of the fear of losing his wife, his mother, losing everything. I looked at him. No anger. I only saw a man trying to untangle the ropes he had tied around himself. Then it was my turn. I narrated, slowly and clearly, every small detail. Margaret's incessant calls, the fertility gifts, the words that made me believe my body was at fault. I spoke of the feeling of being scrutinized, of mental intrusion within my own home. Every sentence, every word, I chose to speak like someone wiping the dust off an old mirror. Evan bowed his head. Margaret brought her hand to her mouth, tears flowing without being wiped away.
She looked down at the tiled floor, afraid to meet anyone's gaze.
Claire watched them, feeling no resentment, because by now I understood. Everything was just fear disguised as affection. Evan was afraid of losing control. Margaret was afraid of losing her role as a mother. And I was afraid of not being loved. And when fears meet, they become shackles. The judge listened, his eyes calm. When I finished speaking, the room fell silent again, as if no one dared to breathe too loudly. Outside, the sun had fully slanted toward the afternoon. A beam of light pierced through the doorway, shining onto my table. A golden light, soft, warm enough to steady my hand. My lawyer stood up and presented the case briefly. No drama, no aggressive accusations. Just clear evidence, line by line of text messages, every email, every medical advice masquerading as concern. When the session concluded, the judge nodded. His voice rang out, decisive but not cold. The court acknowledges the existence of emotional manipulation and medical harassment. I heard those words, feeling no elation. I only felt my chest open, like a long closed door being gently pushed ajar. Evan lowered his head. Margaret broke down in sobs. Her cries were fragmented, but then subsided. I looked at them, my heart light. Not because I won, but because I had walked the entire path I needed to walk. My lawyer turned to me, smiling. "You just won back your voice." I nodded slightly, but didn't reply. Because I knew that voice didn't need to echo out of the courtroom. It only needed to come alive inside me. When everyone had left, I stayed seated for a moment longer. The afternoon sunlight hit the wall, reflecting onto the large glass pane opposite. My image was blurred within it, mixed with the golden light and the shadows of those who had just exited. I picked up the picture frame I had brought with me, the only item I had carried in my bag since leaving the house. I placed it on the chair next to me,
tilting it so the light streamed into the center of the frame. There was no picture, only an empty space. But this time, empty didn't mean missing. It was a space for a new beginning, a part of life not imprisoned by anyone's gaze. I stood up, carrying the frame, and walked toward the door. The light outside shone directly on me, so bright I had to shield my eyes. As the glass door closed behind me, my reflection bounced back on the transparent surface, small but distinct. For the first time, I saw myself standing on the right side of fear. And on that side, there was no shouting, no victory, only the sun and freedom. After the courtroom session, I walked out of the building, the glass door closing behind me with a soft sound, like a sigh. No one was with me. No one was needed. Claire stepped out, taking a deep breath, the wind moving through her hair. The air carried the scent of sea salt and the distant sound of car horns, enough to make me feel that the world was still turning, and for the first time in years, I was no longer being swept away by it. I stood on the steps for a long time, watching the flow of people passing by. No one paid attention to me, no looks of pity or judgment. That normalcy felt strange to me. Perhaps true freedom is not as loud as I once thought. It is just the ability to blend into the crowd without needing to hide who you are. Another gust of wind blew through, making the hem of my coat flutter slightly. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of my hair touching my cheekbone, thin and real. In my mind, a sentence rang out clearly, one that no one taught me, no one commanded. I don't need anyone to acknowledge me. I only need to believe in myself. I repeated the phrase in silence, testing if it fit me. And strangely, it fit perfectly. Like a garment I had once put away, believing I wasn't worthy to wear it. The next day I packed. Only a few small boxes, just the essentials. My sketchbooks, a few journals, the old vase, the picture frame. I left everything else behind, not out of regret, but because they no longer spoke to me. Late that afternoon, I drove over the bridge spanning the river. On both sides, the sunlight reflected off the water, glistening like fragments of broken glass. I stopped in the middle of the bridge, rolled down the window, and let the wind rush over my face. The feeling made me want to laugh, a real laugh, not polite, not suppressed. The apartment I rented was small but bright. Claire moved into a riverside apartment, white walls, warm sun. No one was waiting for me there. But when I opened the door, I heard sounds I had long forgotten. The breath of the empty space, the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor, the wind slipping through the window frame. All of it was gentle and real, as if the apartment itself knew how to say, "Welcome home." I spent the afternoon cleaning. Every layer of dust was wiped away. Every empty wall space was returned to the light. I hung curtains, changed the bedding, set the kettle on. No grand tasks, but every action made me feel like I was slowly touching a real life. When finished, I brewed tea and sat down on a chair near the window. The river outside was changing color, from silver to gold, then pale purple. The last light of the day shone through the window, casting a long streak on the floor. I looked up, watching it touch the wall, spreading slowly, warm, like human skin. I didn't turn on music. I didn't need human voices. I just listened to the sound of the water boiling, the wings of a bird passing by, the wind hitting the glass. Every sound seemed to be saying, "You are finally here." That evening I wrote a few lines, not a letter, not a diary entry, just the notes of a person who wanted to remember this feeling. I stopped waiting for someone to tell me I was right. I simply chose to live a life that doesn't need permission. I folded the paper and placed it inside the empty picture frame. Now, it was no longer a reminder of what was missing, but a place where things yet to come could exist. That night I slept without locking the bedroom door, not because I forgot, but because I believed. Believed in where I was, believed in who I was becoming. The next morning I woke before dawn. The room was quiet. The small clock on the desk read only 5 o'clock. I brewed a cup of coffee and opened the window. The morning air was cool, carrying the scent of water and fresh wood. Across the river the sun was rising. The first light streamed through the window, shining onto the white wall. I sat still, unmoving, just watching. Every morning, the light touched the wall, soft, like the universe's apology. I smiled, not knowing who it was for. The past, myself, or the life that was still unfolding. But perhaps it no longer mattered, because sometimes justice doesn't come from a verdict. but from the moment you realize you are calm enough to listen to your own heart again. Mornings in the new apartment were slowly becoming my familiar rhythm. The sound of water running from the faucet, the faint scent of roasting coffee, the gentle lapping of the river against the shore. No more frantic phone calls, no more voices deciding things for me. Only the sound of breathing, real, deep, and slow. I practiced yoga, I wrote, and I let my body speak for the fear. Each morning, I rolled out the mat in the middle of the living room, inhaled deeply, and bent over. Every simple movement, reaching out, holding balance, releasing, made me realize my body had never truly been listened to. I used to think fear resided in the mind, but it turned out it settled in the bones, the muscles, the shallow breaths. When I looked up, the light flooded in through the window. I let it shine directly onto my face, letting my eyes sting slightly, to feel the sensation of being seen. Something in me softened. An internal space that was once constricted was now filled with warmth. After my practice, I sat down at the writing desk. I didn't write about the past, nor did I accuse anyone. I only wrote about the small things I had missed, the smell of morning bread, the laughter of a neighbor's child, the color of the sky shifting from blue to silver. The more I wrote, the clearer I heard my own voice. Not the voice of justification, not the voice of a victim, but the voice of a survivor, even-toned, calm. I suddenly remembered a line from an old book, "Healing is not loud." And I thought, yes, healing is not noisy. It is when a person can sit in silence and not feel empty. At noon I hung new curtains, pale cream, sheer fabric, allowing the wind to pass through. When I looked up, I saw the empty wall opposite. That space had once waited for something, a photo, a promise, or a shadow. I opened the cabinet and retrieved the empty picture frame. It had been a long time since I touched it. The wood surface was still smooth, the silver edge slightly scratched, faded in a few places by the sun. I placed it on the wall, securing it with a small nail. I didn't need to measure it to be perfectly straight. I just wanted it to be there, as an acknowledgement that empty spaces also deserve to remain. Now it wasn't empty. It was a testament to survival. I stepped back a few paces. The afternoon light reflected through the glass, casting a pale yellow stripe on the wall. I saw my shadow in it. Not sharp, only a faint outline, but recognizable enough. It had been so long since I dared to look for a long time into a mirror, or anything reflective. I used to be afraid of my own gaze, because it held questions I wasn't ready to answer. Who did you leave behind? Do you deserve to be happy? Now, looking back, my eyes were different. Not stronger, not prettier, just truer. The small lines around my eyes didn't make me sad. They were like evidence that I had walked through something heavy, and I was still here. I looked into it, seeing my real face. Not the face of the good wife, the obedient daughter-in-law, or the woman who was cared for by others. Just the face of a person who was living. I smiled faintly. Not exactly happy, but light. A strange sensation spread from my chest, peaceful, slightly trembling, but healing. In the evening, I opened the window. The river breeze rushed in, bringing the sound of water hitting the shore, steady like a breath. I let the room grow dark, not turning on the light. In the faint darkness, the moonlight shone onto the frame, reflecting a small halo of light. I sat down, listening. No clock ticking, no human voices, only the sound of the wind and the water, like a lullaby for someone who had just relearned how to live. I closed my eyes,
Everything within me gradually settled down. The fear, the anger, even the fragments of old affection. They didn't disappear, they just lay still, like small stones at the bottom of a lake. And when the water is calm, they become clear. I inhaled deeply, then exhaled, a long breath, unbroken. In that breath, I heard myself, no longer the voice of someone trying to prove something, but the voice of someone simply grateful to still be here, still breathing. The furniture exhibition was held in a refurbished old warehouse. Yellow light streamed through the iron window frames, illuminating rows of wooden, ceramic, and rough linen materials that smelled of dust. People walked slowly, speaking in low tones, as if afraid to disturb the sense of well-being built on light and silence. I came at the invitation of an old friend, with no specific goal. After months of being alone, I just wanted to stand in a crowd without feeling lost. As I bent down to examine a table made of rough oak, a man's low, gentle voice spoke next to me. "It's beautiful, but a little too heavy for a riverside apartment, don't you think?" I turned around. A man, around 35, wearing a beige linen shirt, hands in his trousers pockets, his gaze calm. He smiled, not rushing the conversation, just waiting for my reaction. "You can tell I live near the river?" I asked half-jokingly. "The wind," he said, gently pointing to my hair, which was moving slightly. "It carries the scent of water." I laughed, the first time in weeks that the sound of my own voice didn't feel strange. He offered his hand simply. "Daniel." I shook his hand, his skin feeling warm and dry. "Claire." "Would you like a coffee?" he asked, as naturally as asking about the weather. No other questions, just a gentle smile. I nodded. The cafe was just outside the exhibition hall, with large windows overlooking the docks. We sat opposite each other, among other strangers who had also just left the event. There was none of the awkward hesitation typical of a first meeting, only a comfortable quiet, where two people weren't trying to say anything to fill the void. Daniel asked a few simple things: what I did, where I lived, if I liked designing my own home. I answered briefly. He didn't press further. We talked more about materials, light, and how people choose to arrange space to tell the story of themselves. He told me he used to be an architect, but for the past few years, he had only taken on small projects, renovating old homes, designing furniture from reclaimed wood. "The more I do it, the more I realize what I love isn't building, it's preserving," he said. "Preserving what deserves to exist, fixing what can be saved." I remained silent for a moment, feeling something in his words resonate. He didn't look at me, just continued to stir his coffee, the motion steady, habitual. Towards the end of the afternoon, he asked, "Are you free next weekend? There's a craft market near the bridge, lots of woodworkers there." I thought for a moment, then nodded, not out of curiosity, but because of a feeling of safety, something I thought I no longer believed in. That weekend, the sun was gentle. We met at the market entrance. Daniel wore a brown jacket, carrying a canvas bag. He bought 2 cups of apple tea, handing one to me. "Don't worry about the heat, it cools down quickly," he said, his tone almost teasing. We walked slowly among the stalls, hands brushing wood, the smell of varnish, vendors calling out to customers, children's laughter. At one point, he stopped to admire a low-hanging wooden lamp, the light shining through the grain like living veins. "See," he said, "light is only beautiful when it passes through something that once had cracks." I looked at him, not speaking. Inside, something gently resonated. Not love, not infatuation, just the quiet recognition between two people who had known what it meant to break. We stopped at a picture frame stall. Daniel chose an oak frame, with raw, unpolished lines. He asked the seller a few questions about preservation, then turned to me. Do you need a frame for a picture or a mirror? I smiled. I'm not sure yet. Just choose a good one, he said. Sometimes you don't know what you're going to hang, but you need the frame ready. The afternoon passed gently. As we left the market, we walked along the riverside road. The late afternoon sun shone on the water, scattering thousands of bright spots. He talked about woodworking, about the scent of different tree species. I listened, just listened, without interrupting. It felt like walking through a piece of music with a steady rhythm. No climax needed. Before parting, Daniel paused, his hand resting on the wooden bag. I think you'll like this frame, he said. Not because it's beautiful, but because it breathes. I took it, looking at the grain running along the frame. The wood color was warm, the scent subtle, natural. I smiled. You know, I used to have an empty frame. Now I think I can hang it again. He nodded. Good. Sometimes, people don't need someone to heal them. They just need someone to stand close long enough for them to heal themselves. Daniel didn't heal me. He just stood there, allowing me to heal myself. That evening, I brought the frame home. When I placed it on the table, the lamp in the room shone on the wood, bright, warm, and gentle. I touched the smooth surface, smiling. In my mind, there were no more old memories, only the image of the river reflecting the moonlight outside the window, soft, real, and peaceful. The wooden frame lay there, waiting. No need for a picture, no need for words. Only a person ready to fill it with their real life.
Autumn arrived sooner than I expected. The first leaves fell onto the porch, pale yellow and brittle, like the quiet greeting of a year closing. I no longer measured time by my pain, only by the number of mornings I could open my eyes, brew tea, and feel my heart not constricting. Daniel still visited on weekends. He brought no flowers, no gifts, only coffee and a few new wooden planks. He fixed my bookshelf, sometimes helped me hang a few small paintings by anonymous artists. Each time he worked, the apartment took on the scent of new wood, a smell that made me feel like I was in a place where I truly lived, not a hiding spot. When I stood to make coffee, he sat at the table, reviewing some blueprints. Little needed to be said, but his presence made the room's echo less sharp. Claire felt, for the first time, that she didn't need to be defensive. No need to guess if I said anything wrong, or did anything that might make someone else uncomfortable. I simply existed, whole, unedited. One morning, when the sun had not yet fully penetrated the curtains, Daniel asked, "Are you afraid of loneliness?" I smiled. No. I once lived in a house full of people and still felt lonely. Now at least, this loneliness is my own. He nodded gently, his eyes soft. I understand. I looked at him, noticing his smile was very slight but real. There was no intention to claim space in it, only presence. Sometimes, the right person doesn't come to rescue, but to listen. I said it, half for him, half for myself. Daniel chuckled. Am I good enough at listening to be considered the right person? Acceptable, I replied, and we both laughed softly. We didn't talk much more. No need to define the relationship, no promises, no attempts to label it. Some mornings he brought apple pie and we ate in silence, listening to the cars outside, occasionally talking about the light, the kind of light that changed hourly throughout the day. I realized that when a person doesn't need to prove their importance, they naturally become the most important person. Another morning, I found a small envelope tucked under the door. Ivory paper trembling, familiar handwriting. One morning, Claire received a handwritten letter from Margaret. I sat down on the chair and opened it. The faint scent of lavender wafted out, evoking memories of distant afternoons, where every expression of care was conditional. I inhaled, slowly, then read. The lines were shaky. If there is a next time, forgive the mother who was afraid of being useless.
I didn't know that loving you was different from holding you back at all costs. I let my fear make me say and do the worst things. Don't remember me by those things, Claire. Remember me by the last time, when I heard you speak without interrupting. If there is another life, I hope to be your mother in a gentler way. I put the letter down on the table. My hand trembled slightly, not from emotion, but because something was dissolving. The heavy weight that had rested between Margaret and me for all those years. I stood up and poured more tea. The steam rose, blurring the tabletop. In that haze, I saw Margaret's image, the forced smile, the eyes that wanted to love but didn't know how. I was no longer angry, only regretful for both of us, for losing so many years to understand that cherishing is not holding on, and holding on is not loving. Daniel walked in, wiping his hands after fixing the door hinge. He saw the envelope on the table and asked softly, "Good news?" I nodded. "It's an apology." He nodded faintly, asking nothing further. He simply poured tea into 2 mugs, handed one to me, and sat down opposite. We were silent for a long moment, each continuing our own thoughts without needing to speak them aloud. "I don't know if I should reply," I said. "You don't have to," Daniel replied. "Forgiveness sometimes isn't in the words,
but in the fact that you no longer feel pain when you mention it." I looked at him, the morning light reflecting off his hair, a small bright streak. Something in that sentence made me want to cry, but I didn't. Just a feeling of warmth, spreading gently from my throat to my chest. I picked up the letter, folded it, and placed it inside the drawer next to my bed. Not to hide it, but to keep it. Like keeping a lesson I had finished learning. When I turned back, Daniel was looking out the window. The early sun shone onto the wooden frame he had brought last week. The warm oak color reflected the light gently, as if it too was breathing. I sat down next to him. Neither of us spoke. Outside, the river flowed steadily, the wind gently touching the curtain. A very strange sensation washed over me, as if the universe, after everything, was subtly nodding at me through that light. In that moment I understood. Some people arrive not to fill the empty space, but to help you see that the empty space is safe enough to stay in.
I read Margaret's letter one more time the following morning. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and clear like the day's first breath. The scent of jasmine tea spread throughout the apartment, mixing with the warm, woody smell Daniel had left after fixing the door hinge. I read slowly, line by line, like someone who wanted to ensure every word fully entered her being, leaving nothing behind. There were no more tears, no more anger, only a strange emotion, a mix of tenderness and distance. When I finished reading, I folded the letter, gently smoothing the edge of the paper. The sheet was soft, slightly yellowed, bearing the trace of her hand and the faded scent of lavender oil. I held it in my hand for a few seconds, then walked towards the corner of the room where the small shredder was placed. I folded it, put it into the shredder, but smiled, because I understood. The sound of the blades running was slow, the paper gradually turning into strips. I watched them fall into the tray below, each small piece curling like unknotted strands of memory. It was strange. Not a feeling of loss, but of lightness. When the machine stopped, the room was quiet again. I placed my hand on my chest, inhaling deeply. In my heart, there was no regret, only a simple acceptance that everything had gone the way it needed to go. Forgiveness is not for them to deserve, but for you to be free. The sentence appeared in my mind, clear and steady, like an inner voice waking up after a long sleep. I realized, forgiveness is not a closed door. It is an open one, for me to step out of the familiar darkness, and for the other person to remain with their lessons. I brewed more tea and carried it to the balcony. Outside, the river glittered, light bouncing off the water like shattered glass reflecting peace. Daniel arrived around noon, still moving with his unhurried gait, carrying a long object wrapped in brown cloth. He placed it on the table and untied the string,
For you, he said.
His voice casual, as if the gift needed no special occasion. I unwrapped it. Inside was a new oak frame, the wood surface bright and smooth, with a natural, pleasant scent. On the bottom edge there was a small, finely carved line of text. Space for our future. I looked at that inscription for a long time. The word "our" made me pause for a beat. Not because of commitment, but because it was as light as an invitation. No promises, no binding vows, just a suggestion that I no longer had to walk alone if I didn't wish to. I touched the wooden surface. It wasn't an illusion. The wood was truly warm, as if it had absorbed the heat from his hands while he worked. Did you carve it yourself? I asked. Daniel nodded. This wood is from an old tree outside my house. I didn't want it to be thrown away. I smiled. You always know how to give everything a second chance. Not everything, he replied. Only things that still want to live. I placed the frame on the table near the window. Light streamed through, illuminating the carving, making the word future glow strangely, as if breathing. Daniel was silent, just observing me from behind. I didn't turn around, but clearly felt his gaze. Not demanding, not possessive, only present. What do you think you'll hang in this frame? He asked. I smiled, still looking out at the river. I don't know yet. Maybe a blank sheet of paper. Maybe a photo that hasn't been taken yet. I'm guessing a mirror. I turned to him, the light reflecting in my hair. Why? Because you've been brave enough to look at yourself again. His statement silenced me. Something within my chest gently resonated, like a guitar string hit perfectly. I simply nodded, offering it as thanks. Outside, the sky was turning to afternoon. Then clouds, light wind. Inside the apartment, the light gradually slanted, touching the wall, then reaching the wooden frame. I sat still, hearing the shredded pieces of paper in the tray slightly shift, the final sound of a completed chapter. Daniel packed his tools, preparing to leave. Before walking out the door, he paused and asked softly, "Do you feel lighter now?" I replied, "Not lighter, but quieter." He nodded, as if understanding that quiet was enough. When he left, I sat alone again. On the table, the wooden frame reflected a golden light, the inscription almost glowing in the dusk. I gently placed my hand on it one more time, not to hold, but to feel my own internal rhythm, matching the breath of the world outside. The shredded paper in the machine still lay still, but I knew that from those fragments, a new part of my life was being cleared for. No one was being judged. No one needed to apologize anymore. Only space, light, and a future wide enough for both people who had stopped being afraid. That morning, the sunlight streamed the curtains, scattering onto the floor in thin, thread-like golden stripes. I opened the window, letting the wind carry the moisture from the river inside. The room smelled of wood and jasmine tea, light, as if the entire space had just been cleansed. On the table, the two frames lay parallel, one new, one old. I placed the new frame next to the old one. The old frame was darkened with age, slightly scratched at the edges, once a symbol of waiting. The new one was oak, brighter, with a smooth, warm surface. Between them was the gap, the space I once called between two lives. One frame held hope, one frame held her very self. I looked at the two frames, seeing myself standing between two versions, the person who once lived for approval, and the person who had just learned self-acceptance. There was no right or wrong, just a continuity, as natural as the changing seasons. Daniel walked in with 2 cups of coffee. He placed one near me, one near the window. "I think you'll like the sun today," he said. I nodded. It's different from every other day. He looked at the 2 frames, smiling softly. "What are you planning to hang in them?" I turned to him, my voice small but firm. A mirror, to see myself, not what they wanted. Daniel was silent, his smile still there, but gentler. He just nodded, like someone who understood that the answer needed no further words. We hung the 2 frames on the wall, side by side. One side was still empty, just the wooden border and reflected light. The other side was the mirror I had bought that morning, the glass clear, untouched by fingerprints. When he left, I stood alone. The light gradually shifted across the wall, then shone directly onto the mirror's surface. The sunlight broke on the glass, reflecting a peaceful smile. I saw my face in it. No longer the woman who once lived by waiting, nor someone trying to prove anything. It was just me, with eyes that had stopped looking for fault, and a smile that was just enough. I walked closer, my fingertip gently touching the glass. The surface was cold, but behind it was my own warmth. Some frames don't need pictures, they just need truth. I spoke softly, hearing my voice echo in the quiet room like a confirmation. I walked out to the balcony. The river below sparkled, small birds circled past. The wind carried the scent of coffee and sunlight inside, touching my neck, light as a gentle permission. I closed my eyes, letting my breath flow naturally. No more heaviness, no more fear. I realized that for all those years, I thought I needed to be cured from the people who had hurt me. But now, I understood. I only needed to stop hurting myself by holding on to the past. In the mirror, I saw the apartment reflected. White walls, flowing curtains, bright wooden frames. There was no perfection, but there was a peaceful order. Everything was in its right place. I sat down on the chair by the window, holding the coffee mug Daniel had left. The slight bitterness, the warm aroma, the trace of steam still lingering. I put the cup down, my fingers leaving a small circular mark on the wooden table, like a sign of life. On the wall, the light continued to move. I looked at the 2 frames again. The old frame was still empty, but in that emptiness, I saw the light streaming in, natural, unobstructed. The new frame reflected that light, doubling it, and returning it to the room. I understood. They were not in opposition. The old frame was where I learned to leave. The new frame was where I learned to stay. Outside, a church bell rang from a distance. The sound dissolved into the wind, floated over the eaves, and merged with my own heartbeat. I rested my head against the wall, feeling real and free. Dusk fell. The light thinned. The sky turned to a soft pink. I stood up, closed the window, leaving only a small gap. From it, the last ray of light shone into the mirror, reflecting a curved, bright streak on the wall, like the room's smile. I smiled back, whispering, "Nothing more is needed." Then I turned off the light, letting the light do the rest of its work. In the soft evening shadow, the 2 frames remained, one reminding me to remember, one reminding me to live. And between them, I, the person once bound by fear, now stood still, breathing, needing no one's permission to be myself. There are some frames that don't need pictures, because the most valuable thing isn't held within the frame. It's in the person brave enough to look into it. I used to be afraid of the light, but when I learned to stand still in it, I finally realized freedom isn't about leaving anyone, it's about returning to yourself. If you have also experienced that feeling of living to please others, tell me your story in the comments section below. I want to know how many people out there are learning to see themselves again. And if you believe that stories like this need to be told, please subscribe so that every time a new light begins, you won't miss it.